Buster growled softly, baring his teeth at me as he stood in defiance, his stance rigid and unyielding, his tail stiff and ears pinned back. He watched every move with alert eyes. My 3-year-old German Shepherd had intuitively figured out the prospect of an upcoming bath when he saw me reach for the towel and decided to give me a hard time over it. I know, buddy. I'm not happy about it either, but I will make it quick. I promise. I tried to reason, holding up both hands to reassure him. But it's not even been a week. I can almost imagine him saying those exact words to me when he crawled back in protest. You're right, but listen man, you're dirty. I can feel your presence from here, I said, standing 10 feet away and pretending to cover my nostrils with my finger. Buster, of course, didn't care and continued to defy without hesitation. I put my hands on my hip and sighed. My glance immediately shifted to a hose attached to a tap outside my quarters. I'll tell you what, I'll make it worth your while. You don't mind the jet spray, right? In fact, you even tolerate it sometimes, I said, pointing to the hose located only a few feet away. How about a little cooperation now, and I'll make you your favorite meal a little later? I asked him, while reaching out to pick a can of chicken liver from the kitchen. As I dangled the can in my hand, I could see it slowly chipping away at his resolve, his mind grappling with the pros and cons of my new proposal. A moment later, Buster barked at me twice and slowly made his way out of the house. He sat by the garden tap, ready to receive his bath. I took a handful of lotion and began to rub it against his torso to remove all the muck and grime that was sticking to his body. We had been quite busy lately, guarding the base and conducting multiple patrols along the perimeter every day. The rain a few hours ago certainly didn't help matters, with Buster leaping over puddles of water and actively rolling in the mud to escape the desert heat. I had to use a brush to remove the layers of dirt that had caked all over his body. It's been a strange week, to say the least. The days were busy but peaceful, while the nights brought scattered, random sounds. Their origins were a mystery, as they appeared not to originate from the base, but I wasn't too worried about it. Not yet anyway. There is an airbase located a couple of hours away from the facility, and it wasn't unusual for them to conduct sorties at odd hours in the night. I assumed they were probably testing some new technology. My colleague Joe thought the same thing as well. But we couldn't take any chances, and we both had a job to do, so we conducted regular patrols around the base just as a precautionary measure. But deep down, I felt something nagging at me, like I was being watched by someone or something. I couldn't exactly put it into words. For a second, I wondered if Buster too felt the same way when I saw him suddenly lift his head up, listening intently with his ears up in attention. I quickly turned back to check if there was anybody standing behind me, but I found no one. When I turned around to face him again, I saw him looking up at the night sky, his gaze focused and unwavering. "What is it, buddy? You see something?" I asked him as I cleared away the foam from his face. Moments went by slowly, and then, just like that, as if nothing had happened, he put his head down and began pawing my leg, urging me to finish the bath. I sighed again and turned on the hose to wash off all the soap. He finally looked presentable, and I have to admit, his coat glistened beautifully under the moonlight. Before I could reach for his towel, Buster swiftly moved in to close the gap between us and looked me in the eye, dead serious. He then shook his body vigorously, much like a wet dog trying to rid itself of wetness, and trotted off without bothering to look back. I laughed out loud as I sat there, drenched in water. I knew I should have seen that coming. However, my smile quickly faded, as it also reminded me of Jessica, my ailing wife. Before another thought could take shape in my mind, I heard a familiar voice blare across the radio.
"Mike, I need you down here. Get to the post, quick."
It was my colleague Joe, and I replied back in the affirmative. I quickly grabbed my gear and signaled Buster to follow after me. When I reached the post, I saw Joe standing there armed with his rifle. As a seasoned war veteran with 2 tours under his belt, Joe was a dangerous man and not to be trifled with. But he was also compassionate and wise beyond his years. "What's up, Joe?" I inquired as I approached him near the entrance of the base. "I'm not sure yet. I thought I heard something in the distance. It could well be nothing," he replied after a brief pause. "Well, we've had a lot of that going around all week," I thought to myself, He then turned around to look at me. "I want you to run a perimeter sweep first, then go on patrol again. Take Buster with you," he said before heading back to his post. I studied the jeep and drove out towards the perimeter. The engine hummed softly as I navigated the rough terrain, with Buster sitting alertly beside me. After finding nothing suspicious during my initial sweep, I decided to broaden my search radius. A mile into the drive, Buster suddenly started barking, prompting me to stop the jeep immediately. He leaped onto the ground and dashed towards a boulder located a short distance away. I picked up my rifle and cautiously followed after him. When I reached the spot, I keyed the mic attached to my shirt and said, "Boss, you need to come see this." I knew he wasn't going to be happy about leaving the guard post unmanned, but I thought he would prefer to come and inspect this himself. Joe arrived 10 minutes later, parking his vehicle next to mine. He walked towards the boulder overlooking a small pond and switched on his torch to get a better look at the skeletal remains of an animal dumped nearby. 3 other animal remains lay next to it, all appearing to be in a similar condition. These look like coyotes, probably stopping by to drink water from the pond before they were killed, he observed, his voice expressing concern. "Did you find them like this?" "Yes," I replied. "And they weren't here when I drove through the same place this morning. I thought it was quite odd, to be honest, to find 4 of them out here all at once in the middle of the desert. That too at this hour." Joe simply nodded in agreement. "What sort of creature do you think did this, Joe? I mean, it must have a ravenous appetite to chew every sinew of flesh from the bone and lick it this clean," I said, leaning in to take another look. "Do you think it could be the chupacabra or something similar?" I continued, knowing fully well my question was a bit far-fetched, but I had to still get it off my chest. Joe finally stood up, switched off his torch, and looked around the vast open desert in quiet contemplation. "This is in fact the 5th sighting in less than a week, Mike, and all have occurred in close proximity to secure government installations. The one before this was even stranger and happened near a military base where an old buddy of mine continues to serve. He told me in that instance the remains belonged to a dog. There were no signs of flesh or connecting tissue from the nasal region to the abdominal section, while the region spanning from the abdominal cavity to the tailbone was left fully intact. The whole thing was carried out with surgical precision and drew morbid praise from even the medic back at the base." "But how is that even possible? What are you suggesting, Joe?" I asked, surprised by the tone of my own voice and my inability to hide my disappointment upon hearing about it for the first time. "This is not a hunt for prey, Mike. This is a hunt for attention. Somebody is trying to make a point, and I'd say they are accomplishing their objective," Joe said. When we got back to the base, Joe updated the command center about the new developments. I headed back to my quarters and lay down on my bed. My exhaustion washed over me and I immediately drifted to sleep. I looked at my Mickey Mouse watch. The time was 5:36 p.m. I was licking my ice cream while sitting next to my mom in the car. To my right was my 4-year-old cousin Henry, who was fast asleep on his mother's lap. In the front, my dad was driving the car with his brother seated next to him. Then, a truck from the opposite side suddenly came into our lane and rammed into our vehicle, causing it to turn turtle. With great difficulty, I managed to extricate myself and pulled my cousin out from the wreckage as well. And then suddenly, the car exploded and went up in flames. I opened my eyes and realized I was still in bed. The same dream had come and gone 1,000 times before. It has become a constant part of my life ever since I was a 9-year-old kid. I slowly got off the bed and found my head hurting. I had barely slept since last night's excitement, and my mood was already beginning to turn foul. Buster was already awake. I gently patted him on the head as I walked into the kitchen to put a kettle of water on the boil and turned on the TV. My attention immediately shifted towards the news. There was a nuclear explosion in Russia in a small town that was just a couple of hours away from Moscow. The details regarding the explosion were still shrouded in speculation. Just the kind of news to start the day. I groaned as I reached for a nearby chair in the kitchen. But what could have caused this? I thought to myself a little later and hoped the damage there was minimal. I then looked at the clock and set about getting ready for work. I showered, ate my breakfast, and was out the door by 8 with a hot cup of coffee in hand. Buster raced ahead to get to the guard post. Joe had already completed his shift and was waiting for me to relieve him of his duties. We high-fived as usual as he began to walk back to his quarters. I settled into my chair and made an entry in the logbook. My name is Michael, a 30-year-old security guard working for a secret government installation located in an obscure area in the hot Nevada desert. The facility is centered around a medium-sized building occupying 7,000 square feet of space. A 10-meter high wired fence had been erected around the base to provide added protection. There was nothing else around the facility for miles, with the exception of a few boulder fields and mountains in the distance. For over 5 years now, my colleague Joe and I have been working in shifts to ensure the guard post is manned at all times. When compared to other secret government bases, the security requirements here are not as stringent. And yet, neither Joe nor I ever had any clue about the kind of work being done here. Every day like clockwork, a bus carrying 25 people would arrive at the facility at 9 a.m. sharp. I had to open the gates to let them through once the customary security checks were performed. These people always wore lab coats and looked like scientists. They would work in the facility until 5 p.m. and would leave by the same bus at the end of the day. In all that time, they never once smiled or waved at me. It was as if their bosses had strictly informed them to not even initiate eye contact with people outside their circle. Anyway, I never took offense to any of that. My job was to provide security to the facility, and I was doing that to the best of my ability. As I sat back in my chair, ready to take another sip of coffee, my phone began to ring. It was from the hospital, and I answered it. A minute later, I called Joe and asked him to stand in for me. He immediately understood. When he arrived at the guard post, I apologized for the inconvenience, and Joe simply nodded with a reassuring smile. As I was about to climb into my jeep, I pointed my finger at Buster and said, "Stay. Take him with you, Mike. She will be happy to see him." Joe said quickly, intervening. "But boss, I don't want to leave you here alone after last night," I protested. Joe waved his hand dismissively. "Get going, Mike. That's an order. And don't worry about me. I'll be fine. Go see Jess and tell her I'm rooting for her," he said before walking back to the guard post. I put a leash on Buster and climbed into the jeep with him. I started the vehicle and began driving towards the city to check on my wife, Jessica. She was receiving treatment for lung cancer at St. Mary's Hospital, which was a 5-hour drive from the base. Jess had never smoked once in her life, and for her to go through all this hardship really broke my heart. I would have normally liked to stay by her side during this crisis, but I could not afford the cost of treatment on my own. Thankfully, the insurance from my government job so far helped me cover most of the medical expenses. After arriving at the hospital, I headed straight to her room and found her with tubes attached to her mouth. She was heavily sedated and looked like she was in pain. Buster was standing by the door, looking glum. He could see that Jess was unwell. Buster came into my life as a surprise birthday gift from Jess, and he has been a part of our family ever since. The people working at the hospital regularly allowed him inside the premises, knowing fully well that his presence always helped to uplift her spirits. I came to know from the doctor that Jess had suffered a heart attack due to long-term COVID complications. While she was stable and out of danger for now, she did need to undergo an emergency surgery within the next 3 days. The surgery alone would cost $30,000, and that was not covered by my insurance policy. I pulled Buster by the leash to tell him it was time to go, but he kept resisting. He wanted to sit by her side for some time, even though she was unconscious and unable to acknowledge his presence. So I too pulled up a chair and sat beside him. It immediately brought back happy memories of our marriage. We used to spend our summers going on long drives, visiting national parks, or idly sitting by the beach, enjoying good food and playing all kinds of sports. Jess and I would also often embark on scenic routes with no particular destination in mind, allowing the road to guide us towards hidden gems. Whether it's a visit to a historic village or a hike through a lush green forest, all the shared experiences helped strengthen our bond as a family. The two of us also enjoyed using Buster to pull pranks on each other. Whenever Jess gave him a bath, she would command Buster to go shake in front of me, and I would get drenched in water, leading to fits of laughter all around. It was one of her favorite pranks. So when I saw my wife on the bed with tubes attached to her mouth, I got the reality check I needed. I stood up from my chair and yanked harder at his leash. He didn't resist this time and followed after me. I walked out of the hospital feeling a bit dazed. As I started to drive back to the base, my mind was busy trying to come up with solutions. I had only $2,000 in my bank account, and that clearly wasn't enough. Maybe I could contact an official from the government and apply for a loan, I thought to myself. I kept driving while mulling on the best course of action. Then, at a certain point, I suddenly snapped to my senses and immediately stopped the car. I had been driving for over 4 hours now. It was 7 in the evening, and night had already fallen. Yet, I could not spot the base in the distance. Usually by this time, the floodlights would have been turned on, and the facility would be easily visible for miles. Instead, all I could see up ahead was pitch-black darkness. Something was wrong. I tried calling Joe on his phone, but he was unreachable. I pressed the gas pedal and drove as fast as I could. When I finally reached the facility, the situation looked much worse than I had feared. The entrance gate was left half open, with no one manning the guard post. The entire building just sat there in the darkness with no power. I tried calling on Joe's number again. No response. I then called Joe's boss, who was stationed in Carson City, to inform him of the situation and possibly request reinforcements. He was unreachable as well. What on earth is going on? I asked myself. This was completely bewildering on so many levels. I slowly drove up to the base and stopped the jeep a short distance away from the front gate. I wanted to be able to make a quick exit if things turned hostile. I took a torchlight from the dashboard and unfastened my sidearm from the holster. After getting down from the vehicle, I swiftly whistled towards Buster to follow me. When I walked past the gate and checked the guard post, I saw a body lying face down on the floor. From a distance, it was difficult to identify the person clearly, but as I got closer, I recognized Joe's uniform. I ran towards him and turned him around and got the shock of my life. I stumbled back in fear and hit the floor hard. I don't know what they did to Joe, but he was lying there, dead, very dead. It was like he had been zapped or electrocuted. The only thing that was remaining of him was his skeleton. Not an ounce of flesh was visible on his body, and yet his uniform looked in pristine condition. How is this even possible? I asked myself. It immediately reminded me of the dead coyotes I found on patrol the previous night. Could this all be somehow related? Was this an execution? And was this carried out by the same group of people? I wondered. Joe's rifle was still there, leaning against the wall. I holstered my sidearm and picked up his rifle. I checked the magazine. He hadn't fired a single shot. I then turned on the tactical light and started moving towards the government facility. No one could enter this building until they had a high level of clearance, and every person who had clearance was issued an electronic key to gain access. So I was shocked to see the door was left ajar here as well. Before entering, I headed back to check the junction box. The darkness was making me paranoid, and I wanted to see if there was anything I could do to fix it first. When I reached the box, I discovered that the power had been deliberately shut down. I turned it back on, and the entire place lit up like a Christmas tree. But the whole facility wore a deserted look. The bus that was usually used to ferry the scientists was still parked at the parking lot. I doubled back towards the entrance and slowly entered the building with my rifle pointed forward. This was the first time I was setting foot inside the facility, and if this was supposed to be a top research lab, I wasn't seeing any signs of it. The place had been hastily evacuated. There was not a single soul inside. All I could see was waste paper and computer cables strewn across the floor. Everything else had been cleared out. Buster then took off on his own and dashed towards the far end of the building. Something had caught his fancy, and I followed after him. He stopped against a large couch and started barking at me. I looked down and could see something metallic hidden underneath. I stretched my hand to retrieve an aluminum briefcase with bloodstains all over it. Someone was obviously holding onto it for dear life, and then tossed it underneath as a last-ditch attempt to prevent it from getting into the wrong hands. Did the scientists manage to escape? Or did something bad happen to them, like it happened to Joe? Could the nuclear explosion in Russia have something to do with this? Are the two countries about to go to war? Is this to be viewed as an escalation? I wondered. 100 questions were going through my mind now, and I had answers to none of them. I decided to get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. I saw no point in staying now that Joe was dead and the facility had also been cleared out. I ran back to my Jeep, tossed the briefcase in the backseat, and began my drive back to the nearest city I could think of. 20 minutes into the drive, I began to get curious about the briefcase, and I had to stop the car to take a look. I switched on the light in my vehicle and opened the briefcase. There was some kind of telescope inside. On its base, it bore the insignia of a bright burning sun with a single eye at its center. It also had the name tag attached to it that was labeled Corell ZX4, 1969. The telescope itself was a strange-looking contraption, the likes of which I had never seen before. It was the size of a camcorder and comfortably fit within the palm of my hand. There were 2 identical knobs on either side of the device. The one on the left moved freely clockwise or counterclockwise. It felt similar to those old radio transistors, where you could switch back and forth between stations. The knob on the right looked the same, but had a small pointer attached to it. It had limited range of motion and worked like a switch. Close to the pointer were 3 printed dots, one larger than the other in ascending order. I guess this signified the 3 levels in which this device functioned. I held the telescope gently in my hand and peered into the eyepiece. With the moon being the only source of light in the desert, I could hardly spot a thing. I then turned the knob on the right, and the device immediately roared to life. I could even feel it mildly vibrating in my hand. As I peered into the eyepiece again, I now had clear vision of the space all around me. A green display had opened up and was providing clean imagery with stunning levels of detail. I slowly started to turn the knob on the left, and the telescope began to zoom in and out. I could now clearly see the creatures of the desert, miles away, coming out of their holes, looking for prey, their heat signatures capturing perfectly the contours of their own bodies as they moved swiftly across the sand. As I kept zooming in further, I could also spot the local diner of the nearest town that was more than 50 miles away. I could not only figure out the make and model of cars parked in front of the restaurant, but also read the number plates on them. And then I looked upwards, pointing the telescope at the night sky, hoping to see the stars a little more clearly. And suddenly, everything became obscure. It was like staring at a blank wall. I moved the telescope away, looking confused. Everything looked normal. There was an abundance of stars scattered across the sky, and there were hardly any clouds. I looked into the telescope again and started zooming back, and my heart suddenly skipped a beat. Thousands of feet high up in the sky, a large spaceship was hovering mid-air. It was big enough to accommodate an entire football field. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I kept staring at it for several moments. Then, I slowly began to pan the telescope across the skyline, and soon realized that I was in for an even bigger shock. There were at least 2 more spaceships thousands of miles away. Make no mistake, they were clearly visible as the one I was standing in front of. "Okay, Mike, what else you got?" I said out loud to myself. I then turned my focus back to the ship in front of me and turned the right knob again. The second dot got highlighted on screen, and the telescope suddenly zoomed in to reveal the insides of the spaceship. The unfolding images were a little grainy, but still definitive enough to provide sufficient visual quality. It was like an X-ray, CT scan, and MRI all rolled into one. As I kept adjusting the left knob to get a clearer view, I could see a large workstation occupying most of the space inside the ship. Close to the panel, 2 people were standing and conversing with each other. They did not look human at all. In fact, they looked like aliens. By this point, I was already sweating, even as the cool winds of the desert were hitting my face and ruffling my hair. I continued to stare into the telescope completely transfixed. I turned the right knob one more time. The last big dot got highlighted on screen. And then, I suddenly started hearing weird noises. Buster, who was keeping silent all this while, let out a soft howl and dug his face into the sand. But the noises didn't stop. It sounded odd and animal-like, like the garbled speech of someone attempting to speak with a mouthful of water. I realized I was now eavesdropping on the aliens talking amongst themselves. I think they figured this out as well, because one of them abruptly stopped speaking, and walked towards a workstation and then punched something on the console. In a matter of moments, the other alien turned around and took a step forward in my direction. It looked like he was peering down at me, fully aware of my existence. A wry smile appeared on his lips, and I felt a shiver go down my spine. I immediately switched off the telescope, put it back in the briefcase, and ran towards my jeep. Buster followed after me. I decided to go to the nearest town and drove as fast as I could. Did that alien really spot me? Am I in trouble? I began to worry. All this combined with the mysterious events at the base only managed to further heighten my paranoia. It took a whole hour for the anxiety to start wearing down. Since nothing untoward had happened in all that time, it was slowly becoming a little easier for me to brush this off as a mere coincidence. When I finally reached town, I decided to stop by my cousin Henry's place. I desperately needed somebody to talk to. Yet, as a precautionary measure, I drove around town for the next 60 minutes, stopping at odd places, just to make sure I wasn't being followed. It was already 5 a.m. when I finally reached his home, and I wasn't surprised to see him awake. He runs a small illegal gambling den in the city and usually works late into the night. Henry was sitting by the fireside enjoying a pint of beer. I quickly brought him up to speed with the events of the day. When I finished, he asked, "Do you still have the telescope?" I nodded. He took it out from the briefcase and pointed it at the sky. I showed him how to work it and warned him not to crank it all the way up to level 3. He nodded. And then, he saw it too. All the 3 spaceships were suspended mid-air, just like I had spotted them the first time. He was in shock and whistled softly to himself. "What's gonna happen, Mike? Why do you think they're here?" he asked. I simply shrugged, not knowing what to say. "Are they going to hurt us?" he inquired, sounding worried. "I'm sure the government already knows of their presence. They must be dealing with them," I replied, though not fully convinced. He then panned the device straight at me and said, "I can see your heart, lungs, spleen and guts from here, Mikey." He then pointed it down to my trousers and exclaimed, "Somebody's packing down there." I grabbed the telescope and put it back in the briefcase. "I want to sell this thing to help pay for Jessica's surgery. Do you know any buyers?" I asked him. He told me about a smuggler in Tipman Avenue, which was an hour's drive away from his house. I decided to visit him first thing in the morning. Henry looked at me in silence. "Mike, you would probably be dead by now had you not received the call from the hospital," he said a moment later in quiet realization. "And don't blame yourself for Joe's death, okay?" he added. "Had you stayed back, you would have all been killed by now, including Buster," he reasoned. I nodded in understanding, but deep down, I couldn't shake away the feeling of guilt. Joe was all alone back there, and had nobody to turn for help. Henry then got up and hugged me tight. "I'm glad you're fine," he said. We spoke for a little while longer before agreeing to call it a night. As I lay down on his couch, I felt the exhaustion kicking in and immediately fell asleep. I looked at my Mickey Mouse watch. It was 5:36 p.m. I was happily licking my ice cream in the backseat of my car when a truck came and rammed into it. I looked around in the car, but I was all alone. I started doing everything in my power to try and get out, but I was unable to open the door. It was stuck. I tried to smash the window with my foot, but I failed again. It was too strong. Then a man looked at me from the outside. He had long hair and wore a French beard. He smashed the glass with his elbow and rescued me from the wreckage. I opened my eyes and realized I was still sleeping on Henry's couch. It was the damn dream again. But it was very different this time, and I had never seen that guy before. When I looked at the clock, I realized it was 3 in the afternoon, and my cousin had already left for work. I got up from the couch, took a quick shower, and put on some of Henry's clothes. While going through his cupboard, I noticed a new jacket and decided to try it on. It fit perfectly, so I decided to keep it. I took out the telescope from the briefcase and placed it in the inner pocket of my new jacket. Got in my car with Buster and took off to meet the smuggler whose address Henry had provided. When I was halfway along, I stopped at a signal to take a right turn to Tipman Avenue. A man with long black hair and a French beard stopped his bike next to my Jeep. I was a little taken aback at the coincidence because he was the same person who had appeared in my dream this morning. I kept staring at him while he had his sight fixed on the road. When the signal turned green, he raced ahead, and I decided to follow him. A few miles later, he stopped his bike in front of a store and walked inside. I straightened my shirt and cleared my throat before stepping out of the Jeep and began formulating a plan in my mind as I walked towards the store. "Good morning, what can I do for you?" he asked me when I entered the same shop with Buster. The man with long hair was manning the counter and appeared to be in the dry cleaning business. He was wearing a sleeveless jacket with a nameplate that read, Adam. To my surprise, there was another person seated just a few feet away who looked just like him. They were in fact identical twins. "You saved my life," I said to Adam. "Excuse me?" he replied back, sounding confused. "You saved my life when I was involved in a car accident, but that was only a dream," I said to him. The brothers glanced awkwardly at each other before breaking into a grin, treating me as if I were a mad person. I simply took the telescope from my jacket and placed it on the counter in front of Adam. I just wanted to see how he would react. And he immediately recognized the device for what it was. He was not laughing anymore, and I now had all his attention. "Who are you?" he asked for the first time, fully serious. "My name is Michael. I used to work as a security guard. I found this lying around in an abandoned building," I said. I refused to divulge any further details about myself. "How did you find me?" he asked, still looking confused. "In my dream, like I already told you. Now I realize this sounds both stupid and bizarre. So did you really save my life? No, of course not. I saved my own life from the car wreck, and I saved my cousin's life as well. But there must be a reason why you came in my dream this morning, because I spotted you on your bike only a few hours later. Now, I have reached a point in life where I can no longer just ignore incidents like these as mere coincidences, so I decided to follow after you. And here I am, right now, in front of you, in your own store." I then tapped on the telescope with my finger and asked, "So, are you interested?" Adam took a deep long breath and finally asked, "Okay, Michael, how much do you want for it?" I said, $30,000 in cash, and would like it now, please." "Why the urgency?" "My wife needs emergency surgery, and I need the 30 grand to make that happen." Adam nodded. "Okay, let's go test this thing upstairs, but your dog stays here. Don't worry, my brother will keep an eye on him. You cool with that?" he asked. I looked at his brother, and he raised his hand to assure me Buster would be fine. I nodded and followed after Adam to the terrace. I could see Adam was comfortable with handling the telescope. He had obviously used it before. He placed it in front of his eye and then began to fidget with the controls. He panned it at various office buildings and continued to keep testing it. He then passed it back to me, saying it wasn't working properly. I took it from him and began testing it myself. I looked into the telescope. The green display was working fine. I could zoom in and out. I then cranked it up to level 2. I could now see various people busy at work inside their offices. When I kept panning the telescope, Adam suddenly came into my line of vision. The telescope suddenly zoomed in to reveal the insides of his chest, and what I saw made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was a little alien residing inside Adam's body, and he was looking right back at me. Before I had any time to react, I fell to the floor, feeling fully paralyzed. Adam had just tasered me. The only thing I could remember after that was his fist coming in contact with my face, and I lost all consciousness. When I finally came around, I realized I was still at the dry cleaners. Buster was busy licking my face and wagging his tail. He was obviously happy to see me finally awake. I looked around the store, and the twins were nowhere in sight. Adam obviously must have carried me downstairs after knocking me out. Meanwhile, on the counter, I saw the telescope, and next to it were a stack of bills totaling $30,000. There was also a note attached to it. It read, "Break your little finger if you get into trouble." I looked at my palm and noticed a tiny puncture mark in the webbing of my right hand, between the ring and the little finger. What did they inject into my hand? What did that note even mean? And why did they leave the money on the counter without even taking the telescope? I thought to myself. My head was swimming with many unanswered questions, but I was grateful for the money. I immediately wired it to the hospital and asked the doctor to get started with the surgery. But first, I wanted to check in on Henry. For some inexplicable reason, I began to worry about his safety. I got in my car and started to drive towards his place. When I parked the car outside his home, Buster immediately began to bark. He could sense something was wrong too. I took out my pistol from the dashboard and ran towards his house. I decided to enter through the back door, hoping it would give me some kind of tactical advantage if necessary. I kicked the door open and entered the house through the kitchen to get to the living room. My heart sank when I looked at Henry's lifeless body. He was sitting in his favorite chair, killed in the same way as Joe. All that was left of him now were his skeletal remains. I dropped to my knees, and the tears started flowing down my face. Buster started barking loudly again. His face looked really tense, and I soon realized why. 3 large aliens had suddenly come out of hiding, and their eyes were all fixed on me. They were at least 8 feet tall, with large hands and muscular bodies. The alien in front of me was brandishing a baton kind of weapon in his hand. Every time he swished it in the air, electrical sparks flew from it. Buster suddenly lunged at him to tear into his leg, but he casually managed to kick him away. He flew back 2 feet in the air and yelped in pain. I then aimed my gun at him to take him out when another alien whacked me in the head from behind, and I fell to the floor unconscious for the second time in less than 5 hours. When I regained consciousness, I realized I was seated in a large elliptical hall. A huge workstation was occupying one half of the space. This included a giant display at the center that was throwing up all kinds of data. On either side of the screen, there were large control panels with switches, buttons, mini displays, knobs, and other monitoring instruments. I could see at least 10 aliens hunched over, busy at work. 20 feet away from them, I could see a large swivel chair at the center that was overlooking the entire operation. It also had somebody seated on it with their back turned towards me. When I tried to get up, I realized I was confined to a chair. My waist, wrists, and legs were all cuffed to it. I looked around for Buster and found him asleep in a corner. Before I could call out to him, I heard a voice say, "Hello, Michael. Welcome aboard." The person on the swivel chair had turned around to face me. It was the same alien whom I had first spotted while using the telescope. He too was over 8 feet tall with an elongated jawline and a bulbous head that protruded backwards. He did not have a nose, but a triangular slit in its place. But the most unique feature about him was his eye. He had only one, and it was positioned vertically at the center of his forehead. He looked older than the rest of his crew, and it was clear that he was the one calling the shots around here. "How do you know my name?" I asked him. He smiled and said, "You humans like putting all your details out there in the ether. Right from your government records to social media, everything seems to be just a click away." The alien was speaking in his own native tongue, but an AI program in the background was simultaneously translating it into English. He was wearing a large robe with the logo of a bright sun and an eye at its center. I knew I had seen that logo somewhere before, and then suddenly remembered the telescope. I softly uttered the word Corello under my breath, but he picked up on it. "That's right," he said. "I am Captain Corello, and the telescope you found belonged to me." He continued to speak. "I come from the planet ZX4. The telescope was my gift to the erstwhile president when I visited Earth for the first time in 1969. In fact, I have visited Earth many times over the decades. Little did I imagine that one day I would come in possession of it again." He pointed his finger at the telescope they recovered from me, which was now sitting on his desk. "So are you some kind of diplomat? Are you here representing the government of your own planet?" I asked him. "No, I am a private contractor. I come here regularly hoping to get a lay of the land, study your species, analyze your society, gauge how you people function as a collective unit, and to keep track of the developments being made in science and technology. It is an essential part of my job, so when I do finally get the green signal, I'd like to be prepared," he said. Green signal for what? I asked. To colonize your planet and take over your resources, of course, he replied calmly. I just looked at him in silence. Then Corell continued. You see, Michael, even in my part of the world, politics is an inevitable aspect of life. As societies get more advanced, the masses begin to grow a conscience. They become more vocal about individual rights, liberty, the right to livelihood, and those sort of things. But it's a conscience of convenience. They are always willing to look the other way as long as they are not directly accused of being the aggressors. However, the need for new lands and new resources is never going to stop on its own. When you have the ability to terraform any planet to mimic the conditions of your own home planet, it becomes easier to colonize than to have to constantly fix and maintain what is already yours. It also reduces infighting within us because people can now simply move to newer pastures and start afresh. But somebody has to colonize to make that happen, and the government is unwilling to do the dirty work. So they outsource it to people like me. This gives them plausible deniability, which also enabling me to make a lot of money in the process. Everybody is happy in the end. In fact, the Committee of Nations from my part of the world had long ago compiled a list where it was decided to colonize planets in a set order. We extract and utilize the resources of one planet before moving on to the next. Planet Earth has been greenlit for colonization now. He signed off. You think you can just troop in here with a few spaceships and take over our land and its people? I asked him. To assume that there won't be any pushback from 8 billion plus people would be a gross underestimation on your part. We might not have your technological superiority, but that doesn't mean we can't put up a tough fight. We are not living in caves. We are nuclear capable. If we have to go down, we will take you down with us. I added, my tone unwavering. Captain Corell let out a soft chuckle. It's been over a week since my arrival on Earth. I have already informed your government of my plans. The ultimatum has been given. But do you see any pushback on the ground? The average guy is still going to work, picking his child up from school and kissing his wife before going to sleep. So, where is this so-called fight back? Do you know why that is? Because they can't. Every major defense system has already been put under lock and key. The missiles won't fire. The fighter jets can't fly. The drones can't take off, and the nuclear bombs won't detonate. So, how will your people retaliate exactly? Are you going to take your machine guns and start firing at the sky? Furthermore, the governments are already running scared because they know what happened in Russia was not an accident. The Russian government tried to keep pushing their luck, so I let one of their bombs detonate. It sent a clear message to all the other governments, and I now have their complete cooperation. Corell let the silence linger for a moment, giving his words time to resonate, then spoke again. I alone decide what happens to your planet and your people. Neither you nor your government can do anything about it. In fact, I completely control all your defense systems now. Only the commercial flights are up in the air, and they are also being constantly monitored. This is just so that secrecy can be maintained and to avoid the public from panicking. But even that will stop after tonight. He added. What will happen tonight? Cleansing, Corell answered. What do you mean? I asked him. When I visited Earth during the 90s, I was invited on a hunting trip by the then Australian Prime Minister. We shot and killed kangaroos for fun. He said it was important to cull them to keep the population manageable. You see, Michael, when you're in my line of work, it becomes necessary to effectively deal with the criticism that comes with it. Wiping out an entire civilization doesn't work, and it rubs everybody the wrong way. But culling, now, people don't object to that, even if it makes them a little uncomfortable. In fact, they even see it as a necessary evil. So during my expeditions, I allocate a piece of land to the locals, and I let them shortlist and pick whatever they think is of value to them. Almost always, most civilizations pick what is most essential to keep societies running, like engineers, doctors, leaders, teachers, police officers and blue-collar workers, etc. But they are only allowed to pick a few of each. And then of course, the wild and domestic animals to keep the habitat lively and exotic. And that is what will happen to all you Earthlings too. Over the next 24 hours, the population of the human race will drop to 3% of what it is now. Special zones will be earmarked for the survivors. You can hurt your donkeys, goats, chickens, birds and insects, or whatever else you deem is important there. The list of what or who needs to survive has been left for individual governments to decide. He finished off. And the governments are all okay with this? I asked, feeling incredulous. He nodded. They don't have a choice. They are already working on it discreetly, without the public knowing. How can you justify this as culling? This is blatant genocide that borders on extermination. You claim things like the right to livelihood matters, even in your part of the world. Yet you seem completely unfazed about killing billions of people. I don't understand how you can get away with this if law and order holds any sway in your society, I said. Corell smirked and said, Your problem is you see us as equals. We are not. I don't see it that way, and my own people don't as well. When you kill kangaroos and call it culling, it is usually because their overpopulation is a strain on the natural resources. But the other reason is their increasing numbers is an inconvenience to you. Their high numbers disallow you from employing the resources to live your own life. Similarly, a large human population is not only an inconvenience, but also a threat to my own people. If their numbers are high, the humans will constantly feel slighted about losing their own land and will eventually get emboldened enough to do something about it. So when you cull as much as is required, you don't have these problems. They quickly come to terms with their destiny and even demonstrate compliance. Corell said. I still struggled to wrap my head around the casual ease with which he talked about taking so many lives. But don't your own people feel any remorse when they see pictures or videos of dead bodies that run in the billions? There are not going to be any dead bodies, he replied calmly. What do you mean? I asked him. People who don't make the cut, they will be vaporized. I felt the anger rise in me as I just sat there, with my mouth open, unable to speak. So, is that what you did to the scientists at the base? Vaporized them? I asked him, sarcastically. He simply nodded. I also instructed my people to leave the skeletal remains of your security friend, so that it sends a message to your government as well, he said. So doing the same thing to my cousin Henry is you sending me a message, is it? I asked. Yes, he replied in a matter-of-fact manner. My shoulders began to droop, even as every fiber in my body was vibrating with anger. Then I finally asked him, What am I doing here, Captain? Why am I not dead already? Corell looked at me for a moment, and then said, You remind me of myself, Michael. What you are is an agent of death. You may not know it, and you may choose to disagree, but it is what it is. I am nothing like you, I shot back. Corell then flicked his finger, and digital copies of a police report began appearing out of thin air. It was related to the car accident I was involved in as a 9-year-old kid. Corell began speaking again. You threw such a big tantrum when your dad did not stop by your favorite ice cream parlor that he was eventually forced to turn around his car to get you what you wanted. That delay caused your family and your cousin's family to come face to face with a drunk truck driver. I don't need to complete the rest of the story for you. I just sat there in shock. He had managed to prick a raw nerve in me. I had never shared that part of the story with anyone, apart from the police officer who had interrogated me shortly after the accident. Not with my wife, and not with Henry either. I was afraid he would shut me out of his life for good if he ever came to know that I was in some way indirectly responsible for the accident. The guilt was just too much for me to be able to share it with anyone else. But Corell was not done yet. He continued to plunge the dagger into me. Your wife fell sick with cancer within 2 years of her marrying you. Your cousin wound up dead because you brought my business to his doorstep. Your security guard friend Joe ended up dead because he was forced to take on your shift. God only knows what else I will find out about you if I keep looking. I couldn't take it anymore, and I just wanted it to end. What are you going to do to me? I asked him. Corell said, You are worth a lot of money, Michael. I am going to sell you to one of the research groups that study people like you. They will test your blood, analyze your DNA, and pick and prod your brain to understand every minute aspect of your life, right from what time you wake up in the morning, to the kinds of dreams you experience, to how you conduct yourself in different situations, to the kind of girls you like to date. Everything about your personality and decision-making abilities will be studied under a microscope. They will then create clones out of you to be used as a potent weapon in war strategy and espionage-related activities. For the first time, I laughed out loud at the bizarreness of it all. It was all just getting a little bit too much. Captain, you give me way too much credit. I might be unlucky in life, but to say all the things you just did is a bit of an overreach. I am just an ordinary guy with an unremarkable life. There are a lot of guys like me out there. That may be true, but I don't need you to be remarkable. All I have to do is put you in the orbit of people who can do remarkable things, and you will eventually figure out a way to bring them down. Knowingly or unknowingly, wittingly or unwittingly. I just sat there, staring at Corello. He seems to have gotten it all figured out, and was also quite smug about it. Nothing I say was ever going to convince him. I didn't like him from the beginning, but I truly despised him now. Meanwhile, Buster had woken up a little while back and was sitting next to me. He started wagging his tail when I looked at him. That really broke my heart. My fate was already sealed, I knew that, but I didn't want him to have to suffer. "Do you want to spare your dog?" Corello asked me, smiling. I just stared back at him. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of saying yes, but I couldn't hide the desperation in my eyes. He then pressed a button on his armrest, and a display popped up in front of him. He keyed in a couple of commands and started slowly turning a knob. A strange kind of sound suddenly emerged from nowhere. Buster immediately let out a loud howl and ran across the room. It was clear the noise was hurting his ears and was an assault on his senses. He curled up in a corner of the room and was howling in pain. I tried desperately to free myself, but my efforts were proving futile. Corell was looking at me and Buster alternatively and continued to slowly turn the knob. He was really enjoying the show. Buster yelped in pain. He was really hurting now, and my inability to help him was tearing me up from the inside. At that point, all I could think about was Adam's little note. I was desperate enough to try anything. I slit my little finger by the side while the rest remained on the armrest. I tried to use the pointed edge of the armrest to create a wedge between my little finger and the remaining fingers. And then, I jerked my wrist as hard as I could, and my finger dislocated. A sharp pain shot through my body, but I didn't care. By this point, I was simply hoping for a miracle, almost expecting angels to descend from the heavens and save our lives. But Buster suddenly went quiet, and to my horror, his body began to seize. He started experiencing some kind of major epileptic fit. I looked up to see Corello looking equally surprised. Then his expression changed. It changed from surprise to shock to complete panic. He started screaming, "No, no, no!" As soon as he uttered those words, I saw the lights around his spaceship begin to flicker. The first to go was the giant display in front of us. And then, in a matter of seconds, the entire spaceship was plunged into complete darkness. The resulting silence only punctured by Corello screaming a barrage of instructions at his panic-stricken crew. The power came back a few moments later, and I saw Buster motionless on the floor. He had coughed up a lot of blood and was lying in a puddle of his own vomit. A reservoir of anger was building up in me, and I wanted to just explode. I looked up to see Corello, but he was busy living his own version of hell. His gaze was completely fixated outwards. I turned around to look outside and could see two spaceships at a distance floating mid-air. They were no longer invisible. You are responsible for this. What did you do?" Corello yelled with his finger pointed at me. I just sat there, stupefied and completely clueless. I genuinely didn't understand what was happening around me. Look at that," he said, pointing to Buster's little puddle on the floor. And then I noticed it for the first time. There was a small black ball lying in his vomit, and it was emitting a blue light from within. "Where did you get that?" he asked me, sounding really furious. I just gave him a blank look. Corello sank back in his chair. He simply stared at me, his single eye looking vacant and lost, struggling to come to terms at how things were suddenly crumbling around him, like I was somehow the reason behind his current predicament. As much as I was enjoying watching him squirm in his chair, frankly, I thought he was giving me way too much credit. All I did was lean back in a large comfortable chair and bust my pinky. Corell was then alerted by his subordinate about a new problem. 2 ballistic missiles had been fired from different directions, and both were headed straight for the spaceship. He immediately began giving instructions to his crew. I could sense they were preparing for an evacuation, but the spaceship struggled to lift off. It simply didn't have the required thrust to get it done. It went a few feet high up in the air and then dipped back to its original position. Whatever happened to Buster seemed to have somehow severely messed up their technology. I didn't understand how or why, but I continued to watch, fully riveted. Corell then issued a new set of instructions to his staff. I could see from the screen a large force field had been deployed around the ship. His 2 smaller spaceships now set off in the direction of the missiles. Right at that moment, I also heard a very familiar noise ringing in my ear, and my suspicions were soon confirmed. The fighter jets were also back up in the air. I could see 3 F-35s hurtling through the air, heading straight for the ship, ready to take aim. They were probably from the airfield that is not very far from the base. One of Corello's ships turned around midway to deal with the fighter planes. I know our jets are fast and fly at supersonic speeds, but Corello's spaceships were mind-bogglingly quick. Even for the untrained eye, they looked 10 times bigger and traveled at least 30 times faster. The spaceship traversed the distance at an astonishing speed and started firing at the F-35 that was in front of it. The pilot barely had any time to react, and the jet immediately exploded in flames. The other 2 planes tried to lock in on their target to launch another missile salvo, but the spaceship maneuvered deftly to thwart the attack. It then looped back in the air to suddenly insert itself between the 2 planes and simultaneously opened fire at both the F-35s. The remaining fighter planes went down in flames as well. Meanwhile, Corello's other spaceship had already shot down one of the ballistic missiles and was en route to take down the next. As it got closer, it began to slow down and gain altitude. When the missile went past it from below, the spaceship followed after it, and then turned around mid-air, changing the trajectory of the missile along with it. It was as if the missile got hooked with an invisible lasso rope, as it suddenly curved through the air and was being yanked from up above by the ship to set a new course. I was hoping the missile would somehow detonate, taking down the ship with it, but it fatefully tracked itself along the path set by the spaceship. The ship later abruptly stopped at one of the nearby cities, and the missile suddenly plummeted to the ground, triggering a massive explosion. Their target was a large power grid. It was clear Captain Corello was sending a message to my own government and warning them of what was to come if they persisted with this line of attack. Before I could discern any more details, the display on the screen changed to show a map with 7 areas marked in red. Corello's ship was at the center, and the rest of the map covered the entire geographic radius around it. I suspect the areas marked in red were military bases or airfields that were in immediate proximity. The spaceships flew over these locations and airdropped bombs to further delay the possibility of a swift counterattack. The 2 spacecrafts then headed back to protect Corello's ship, and the captain began relaying a new set of commands to his crew. Within moments, I saw a large opening in both the subsidiary spaceships, and they released around 20 cylindrical objects into the atmosphere. Each cylinder was at least 15 meters high and 5 meters wide, with large curved metallic rods on either side that were pointed upwards like antennas. The cylinders were equidistant from each other and were slowly circling the spaceship in a clockwise direction. The cylinders then attached themselves to Corello's spaceship, and the metal rods began their descent. The rods extended horizontally to establish a connection with a cylinder on either side, creating a tight bracelet-like formation encircling the mothership. Meanwhile, the other 2 spaceships were now flanking the mothership, and they looked ready and in position. But ready to do what? What is going to happen? I began to ask myself. Corello's voice suddenly cut through my thoughts. his expression serious as he directed his crew with urgency. Systematically, they initiated the shutdown of various systems, reducing the ship to its core functions. Even the lighting was dimmed to save energy, leaving the large room almost in darkness, except for the vibrant glow of multiple display screens. As I stared at the giant display, I could see my own government was still determined to go on the full offensive. The screen was dotted with a cluster of at least 20 fighter jets from different directions that were headed towards the spaceship. The planes had taken off from bases that were a little far away and outside the immediate radius of Corell's ship. My estimate was they were at least 15 to 20 minutes away, which I guess gave the aliens some time to plan their next offensive. Corell's crew, on the other hand, had managed to deploy a force shield that was large enough to contain all the 3 spacecrafts. Then, the 2 smaller spaceships that were already in position now started circling Corell's ship. Both simultaneously emitted a large beam of electric charge that was targeted towards the metallic rods attached to the cylinders. The beam resembled the likes of a thick electric rope that just lashed at the rods, delivering a huge surcharge of power. The continuous back and forth motion of the ships created the impression of an intense, churn-like activity. Looking at what was happening outside, I wondered if any of us would even survive. Will the ship be able to handle this load, or will it just explode at any moment? I looked at Corell's crew just to observe their reaction. Their gaze, however, was transfixed on the large screen in front of them. There was a marker on the display that was slowly inching upwards. They were building an alternate power source, and it looked like their plan was working. So what were they going to do if they managed to reach full power capacity? Are they going to launch an offensive? Or will they just leave? I wondered. In between all that commotion, something suddenly caught the corner of my eye. I wasn't exactly sure what it was, but it happened really fast. It was like a sudden flash of electric discharge in a remote corner of the room. I strained my eyes in the partially lit space to get a better look, but could see nothing unusual. It was probably just electrical arcing related to some equipment. The charging from the ships went on uninterrupted for the next 10 to 15 minutes as they continued to deliver a huge output of electric charge to the mothership. The uncomfortable silence in the room was only broken when Corell's voice blared across the speaker. I guess it was him reacting to the enemy aircrafts that had now closed in on his spaceship. There were at least 14 of them, and they had already reached the edge of the force field. They immediately opened fire, but the shield so far was holding firm and managed to withstand the coordinated attack. The rest of the fighter planes were also on their way and were probably only a few minutes away. And then, it happened again. The same spark of electric charge that appeared and dissolved at a moment's notice. This time, in the opposite corner of the room. I wondered if it was just me imagining things, or if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Nevertheless, it recurred. In this distance, a mere 20 feet in front of me, accompanied also by a crackling sound and then followed by darkness again. But I managed to catch a glimpse this time. A brief flash that suddenly illuminated the silhouette of a familiar figure lurking in the darkness. Was that Buster? I asked myself in shock, the hair on my arms standing on end. I looked back at the place where I saw him die. His body still remained on the floor, lifeless. Then, there was another loud crackle in the center of the hall, the electrical discharge becoming continuous and more intense with each passing second. And there he was, sitting upright. It was Buster, no doubt, and yet he looked different. He was no longer made of flesh and bones, but what I saw was rather a strange neon version of him. All the electrical discharge that was happening around him was only helping to add more depth to his form, filling him up with a hue of white and blue. He looked me in the eye for a fleeting moment, and then suddenly dissolved into thin air with a soft bang. I nervously glanced at Corell and the rest of his crew. They witnessed it too, and the dazed, weary look on their faces said it all. The uneasy silence, however, was quickly broken by the urgent beeps emanating from the giant screen. The force shield was showing signs of depletion after being under continuous attack from airdrop bombs, rockets, and gunfire. The pilots were obviously giving it their all, but the shield was still managing to hold fort to the onslaught. The remaining fighter jets were also quickly closing in on their target. To add to Corello's woes, I also spotted 2 new projectiles on screen, which I assume were missile launches from my own government. Meanwhile, I could still see flashes of discharges occurring all around the large oval room. But the entire crew was glued at work, and Corello at this point was literally barking at his staff. One of the 2 smaller ships abruptly stopped emitting the beam and exited the force shield to create a diversion, and the fighter jets went after it in full force. The spaceship found itself surrounded and outnumbered by fighter jets in all directions and came under heavy fire. It retaliated by firing indiscriminately at the jets while also bulldozing the ones that simply came in its way, sustaining significant damages in the process. It managed to take down 14 jets in under 5 minutes before going down in flames, buying Corello and his team some more time before the next assault. The other spaceship that was already circling the mothership now picked up its pace considerably and began to emit an even larger output of charge. Next, Corello turned his swivel chair around to face the center of the room to deal with the new in-house problem. He said something on his intercom and keyed in a couple of commands on the console of his armrest. Suddenly, the entire hall was bathed in bright amber light. The amber light enabled me to see Buster properly for the first time since his passing. He looked at odds, unable to come to terms with his new, ghost-like form, hovering around like an astral projection. He was running scared and confused from the electrical charges that were chasing him like a shadow. Every time he slowed down, the electrical arcing would pick up in intensity, which would force him further to keep moving to stop the buildup. I could see him howl and bark with fear, not knowing how to find relief, but no sounds were coming out of him in this state. And yet, he maintained a safe distance from me to ensure my own safety. 3 aliens rushed into the room wielding batons, and they were the same ones who attacked me and Buster at Henry's place. They surrounded Buster from all sides and continuously began to close in on him. There was another alien right behind him, holding onto a glass dome-like object that looked big enough to confine a dock. Buster looked menacingly at his captors, baring his fangs at them as they determinedly tried to close in on his base. However, with no body of his own, there was little he could do to defend himself. He began to retreat carefully, taking a few steps back, stopping just a couple of feet away from a large operations console located directly behind him. And then, he did something beautiful, which dogs normally do to rid themselves of anxiety. Harmless as it was at that moment, it brought a smile to my face for the first time over the wretched last couple of days. Even as a little pup, Buster showed a heightened sensitivity to sound compared to other dogs. He would become paralyzed with fear when he heard loud noises like thunderstorms, fireworks, car horns, gunshots, or even the vacuum cleaner. Being a security personnel, I decided to help him with the anxiety in the best way possible, to zone them out and become a guard dog. I taught him simple commands to help overcome the problem. Stand! Buster would remain standing, alert for the next sequence of commands. Sit! He would rest his waist on the floor while his shoulders would be upright, his face fully focused on me. Down! He would go down on all fours. Close! Buster was trained to close his eyes from a very young age whenever he found himself in stressful environments. I would gently stroke his head continuously in an effort to calm him down. There were times when I would do this for hours on end. Over the years, I have made him repeat these maneuvers thousands of times so that it became second nature to him. The training not only enabled him to respond to existing triggers in a calm manner, but also allowed me to earn his trust implicitly. When the commands are uttered, there is no doubt, no confusion, or reluctance from his part. It's right down to the business end of things. As he got older and stronger, I included more commands to complement his training. Stay. Since he had become accustomed to moving around all the time, I had to first teach him to remain put in his current position. Guard. It could be anything. A ball, a bat, a suitcase, or a person. If he was given nothing, it simply meant to guard the piece of earth he was standing on. Attack! He would go after perpetrators or unknown assailants, and I would follow right after him. He instinctively knew that I always had a 6, so when I saw these buggers close in on my dog, I decided to revert back to familiar ground. Buster! I yelled as loud as I could from the other end of the room. He turned to face me, and I immediately sensed the feeling of relief descend upon him.
Stand, sit, down, close, stand, sit, down, close.
I kept repeating the commands as Buster dutifully started to follow them. He soon became oblivious to the electric discharge that was happening around him, even as it was steadily building in intensity with every passing second. He also ignored the aliens that were trying to close in on him. His focus was on me, all on me. The aliens were exchanging confused looks with each other, unsure about what exactly was going on. The look of bewilderment on their faces was understandable, for they could not figure out if their job had suddenly gotten easier, or if they were simply walking into a trap. Corell ordered them to stop wasting time and move ahead, so they continued to move in cautiously. As if approaching a ticking time bomb that could go off at any second, they looked alert with their batons clenched tightly in their hands. The jolts of electric current that were already accumulating into Buster was now lending his form a candlescent glow that was only becoming more and more prominent with time. One of the aliens to the right then pointed his baton that ejected yet another stream of charge at Buster. The stream, however, was having the intended effect because it was successful in severely restricting his movements. It forced Buster to put in the extra bit of effort to adhere to my commands. The other two aliens also quickly followed suit, targeting him with energy beams from their own devices. As Buster lay down on the floor with his eyes closed, the three alien guards managed to advance considerably, coming within just a few feet of him. The alien with the glass dome was also not far behind and looked ready to get pressed into action at any given moment.
Stand!
I yelled as loud as I could. Buster leaned heavily on his shoulder to power his hind legs off the floor. He was using every ounce of strength in him and finally pushed through to stand fully erect. The aliens by this point were literally holding onto their batons with both hands to try and control the flow of charge that was relentlessly hitting their target. This, combined with the electrical discharge already happening around Buster, now created a halo kind of effect along the contours of his ethereal form. But Buster wasn't bothered about any of this, nor was he making any side glances to check on his captors.
Guard!
I yelled at the top of my voice. Buster got into position, ready to get into attack mode as soon as the words escaped my mouth.
Shake!
He locked eyes with me briefly, just to make sure he heard me right.
Shake! Buster, shake!
And then he vigorously shook his body, just like a wet dog trying to rid itself of wetness. A minor explosion erupted near Buster's position, causing substantial damages to an operations console a few feet behind him and generating thick plumes of smoke. The two aliens who were managing the console had their heads blown off. The security guards, even with all their protective gear, were thrown back 10 feet and lay scattered on the floor, writhing in pain, their bodies bleeding and severely lacerated. Buster looked at the carnage all around him, and he finally managed to figure it out. He got it. He finally got it. Meanwhile, Corell started yelling at his staff with his finger pointed at me. I didn't need to know alien speak to realize he wanted me dead. His senior security guard, who was already badly injured, pulled himself off the floor with great difficulty. Crouched on all fours, he slowly lifted his hand and pointed his baton at me. But Buster was alert and ready. He launched at him from behind, and then something strange happened. In his ghost-like form, I expected him to simply pass through the alien and emerge on the other side. Instead, he wound up entering his body through the rectum and slowly worked his way up. The baton instantly dropped to the floor as the alien writhed in agony, resembling the likes of someone undergoing the painful transformation of a werewolf on a full moon night. His body was being violently lacerated by the electrical discharge that was accompanying Buster. As he moved upward towards the head from the waist down, Buster then slowly emerged from the mouth to descend briefly, only to rise up again like a serpent. He calmly looked at the alien who had kicked him in the face just hours earlier. And yet, only half his body emerged from the mouth, while the rest remained inside, completely frying his head from within. Buster seemed to have realized the longer he waited, the greater the torment it would unleash on his enemies. The alien's head began to swell like a pumpkin as he shrieked in blind pain. I could almost see his head bursting at the seams. The hitless body hit the floor with a loud thud, with fragments of blood and bone scattering everywhere. Corello's crew members were absolutely mortified and immediately vacated their stations to form a huddle in a corner of the large oval room. They looked panic-stricken at the rampage Buster was on and turned a deaf ear even to the emergency beeps emanating from the giant screen. A quick peek at the screen revealed that the missiles were only a few minutes away. The jets that were already in transit had now reached Corello's ship and started a fresh line of attack. The force shield so far was still absorbing all the firepower, but was fast depleting in strength. Also, my own government deployed another squadron of fighter jets. There were at least 40 of them this time, and according to my estimate, they were probably 30 to 40 minutes away from reaching the ship. However, there was a silver lining for Corello here. The charging was almost 80% done and nearing completion. The solitary ship was still circling the mothership and delivering a huge charge of power. He just needed a little more time for whatever he had planned next. Meanwhile, Buster menacingly started moving towards the frightened crew members. They looked helpless and trapped and were clinging to each other. I almost felt sorry for them, but they had no reservations about destroying my own species. They probably even saw it just as an ordinary day's work, casually wiping out civilizations with the press of a button. So, I was actually enjoying this, seeing them in their misery. And then suddenly, Buster disappeared into thin air. The electrical arcing that was continuously happening around them also came to an abrupt end. I looked outside and saw the subsidiary ship had come to a halt. I turned my head to look at Captain Corello. He had now turned off the amber light as well. He pointed his finger at his crew members and quietly told them to get back to their seats. They complied reluctantly. Right then, two aliens teleported themselves into the oval room. They both came and stood next to me on either side of the chair. They looked like security officers, and I could tell from their demeanor that they were summoned to keep an eye on me and to keep me quiet by whatever means necessary. Corello then turned back to focus on the screen. The only remaining subsidiary ship also now exited the force field and shot up into the sky like a rocket. 3 of the 6 fighter jets went after it, while the rest remained in position. The spaceship then executed a rapid turn, maneuvering along a semicircular arc that immediately positioned itself behind the pursuing jets. The spaceship, spinning like a frisbee, discharged a 360-degree barrage of fire upon the planes, simultaneously destroying them in the process. It then skillfully began to traverse the long contours of the mothership's force shield, systematically outpacing and outmaneuvering the remaining fighter planes. The pilots struggled to cope with the spaceship's speed and got eliminated one after the other. It then went after the 2 missiles that were en route to the spaceship, turning them into rubble in rapid succession. The spaceship later re-entered the force shield and came back to its original position next to the mothership. Corello immediately turned around to face me. He had just managed to deal with another urgent threat and bought himself some more time. He got straight to the point. "Michael, get out. I've had a change of heart and have decided to spare your life. Get out of here before I change my mind. You can take your dog with you as well." He finished off, pointing to Buster's body on the floor. The cuffs came off at that very moment, and I was no longer confined to the chair. I didn't have to be a bright man to realize what was at play here. To deal effectively with the external threat of my own government, he needed to charge his ship to full capacity, but he couldn't proceed with the plan since that would mean enabling Buster to wreak havoc from the inside, which put Corello in a catch-22 situation. He was probably hoping by getting rid of me, Buster would also follow suit, so I decided to simply play along for the time being. "How am I supposed to do that? My dog is dead because of you," I said. Corello paused briefly for a moment before continuing to speak. "You can confine him in his current state by using a container we provide, but you must summon him to you and see the task through." "And why would I do that?" I asked. "You're going to kill us all anyway. Once your ship starts to work again, you are definitely going to go through with your plans, so why should I do anything you ask of me?" Corello replied, "That plan has been scrapped. We are only looking to leave planet Earth. Nobody else needs to get hurt. This should be seen as a win-win situation for both of us." "If that is true, you would have already done it. I understand that this ship has developed problems, but you could have used the other one to escape, I said, pointing at the smaller spaceship hovering close by. I saw a look of reluctance appear on the captain's face, and I immediately understood. I suddenly burst out laughing. You can't leave Earth without the mothership, can you? Well. It seems the captain is a bit of a control freak, isn't he? Why am I not surprised? People like you have the obsessive need to have everything under your control. No wonder you are trapped. So what is it, Captain? You don't trust your own team, huh? I asked Corallo, smiling. He simply glared at me in silence, and that only made me want to laugh even louder. I knew I was being dramatic, but I just wanted his whole crew to witness someone laugh at their boss. For a second, I wondered if these rascals even had a funny bone to understand what I was saying. But I instantly felt some satisfaction when I saw Corello's green face turn a deep shade of violet. I could see that I was torturing him to sit and negotiate his survival with a lowly earthling. That too, an ordinary security guard at that. I slowly leaned back in my chair and relaxed. Anyways, I am comfortable being where I am, and I have no interest in leaving, I said. But I do have a better idea. Why not all of us die together? We don't even have to do a thing. They will come and do all the work for us, I said, pointing to the cluster of fighter jets fast approaching the spaceship. Corello was trying hard to maintain his composure. He took a quick peek at the screen and then began speaking to me in a slow and menacing tone. Michael, you would be better served to accept my offer, not only for your own well-being, but for that of the entire planet as well. I am not without options here. You have seen the devastation that thing can cause, he said, pointing to his spaceship. Well, it is capable of a whole lot more. You can be rest assured, if I am pushed to the wall, I will use it to flatten out multiple cities, and millions of people will die. And in the off chance me or my crew members don't make it out of here safely, the repercussions would be dire for planet Earth. My part of the world will not take this lying down, Corell warned me. Well, I seriously doubt that. You are just a private contractor, right? I challenged him. I mean, who loses sleep over the death of a contractor? The answer is likely no one, I declared, not bothering to even wait for a reply. They will probably assign the project to someone else immediately. But for argument's sake, let's assume I do help you and you do manage to escape Earth. Why shouldn't I consider the possibility that you might go and station yourself somewhere in the solar system that is just beyond our reach, but well within yours, to attack us again at a moment's notice? I queried out loud. Maybe you will park your ship somewhere beyond Saturn, and then slowly bid your time, waiting for reinforcements. That does not sound like a very positive scenario for Earth now, does it? I mean, I am alive right now only because you see me as a cash cow for some research group. You expect me to believe that you will leave planet Earth alone when you've been waiting for decades to wreck this place? I remarked, skepticism evident in my tone. Your little presentation today about your expansion plans was bad enough for a general sitting. And now that you have been so thoroughly inconvenienced, I shudder to think what a revised plan would entail. Perhaps it's best not to release the animal now that it has been caged, I concluded with satisfaction. Also, I really do doubt if other alien beings out there are obsessed with Earth the way you are. For them to sit and make multiple trips over the years makes me wonder if Earth is actually a passion project of yours, I added as an afterthought. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, they might even move on to another planet and leave Earth alone. Or, if they do decide to come after us, we will figure it out. Either ways, you are not getting any help from me. I waited for him to react, but all I got was silence and a murderous glare from Corello. I continued to speak. You killed my friend and brother, Captain, and you tortured my dog. You don't deserve second chances. And considering you already called me an agent of death, perhaps I was put in your orbit by somebody else to take you down. Heck, when this ship goes down, taking all of you to your deaths, I might even miraculously survive. You never know. And when that happens, I will be waiting here, ready to take a piss on your filthy corpse. I finished off. I was half hoping Corello would snap and go for the kill. It would give Buster the right kind of impetus to go to town with these scoundrels. But he just sighed deeply and signaled his guards to take care of me. He then slowly turned around to continue to lead his crew. The two guards held me by the collar of my shirt and tried to get me off the chair. When I resisted, I felt a hard punch to my plexus. I doubled over in pain only to get punched in the face again. I fell to the floor clutching to my sides when the guard kicked me again in the stomach. Both the aliens were incredibly strong and the pain was excruciating. I knew my ribs had cracked in multiple places. I began to cough up blood and started fading in and out of consciousness. They then dragged my body to the portion of the room that had the teleportation device. I could see a large red-colored, rectangular object fixed to the ceiling. As I lay on my back, breathing heavily, I saw one of the aliens pick up Buster's mortal remains and place it next to me. While I could no longer see him in his spirit form anymore, I knew he was close by, desperately trying to do whatever he could to save me. I tried to speak as clearly as possible while fighting through bouts of coughs. "Buster, stay. Guard. Attack." I was blinded by a flash of white light and immediately faded out of consciousness. A few months later, after buying flowers from the nearby florist, I continued down the road, finally turning right to enter through the gates of the cemetery. A few minutes in, I stopped by the headstone of my cousin Henry and laid down some of the flowers I brought for him. I said a little prayer for the departed soul and then continued walking ahead. A minute later, I pulled out a foldable chair and sat by the tombstones of my wife Jessica and dog Buster. Both of them were buried alongside each other, which I thought was fitting, and their headstones looked beautiful. It's been 3 months since the alien attack happened, and the world has slowly begun to move on. But things have not been all that easy for me. Jessica's surgery had gone well, and she was put on the ventilator to help deal with her breathing problems. But when Corell used one of our own missiles to bomb the power grid, it caused an acute power shortage for the entire city. The explosion and bombings also resulted in the deaths of thousands of people, putting a great strain on the hospital resources. They had no option but to prioritize on healthier patients, which meant letting Jessica go. It didn't help that I was at that point lying unconscious, battered and bruised in a hospital. Had it not been for some well-wisher of mine who rescued me from the desert, I would also probably be dead by now. It took me over a week to regain consciousness, but by then, it was already too late. She was gone. The cemetery's groundskeeper William went out of his way to help me, even assigning burial plots at a location that gave me the space and privacy to grieve for the dead. I guess I have Adam to be grateful for that. When I eventually went to collect Jessica's remains, the coroner had issued me William's calling card. Apparently, he had also came by twice to the hospital to check on me, but I was still unconscious back then. So when I finally did contact him at the cemetery, I was surprised to see that Buster had already been buried there. He also offered the vacant plot next to Buster for my wife, and I was grateful. I guess he must have his own crazy alien story with Adam for him to be so helpful towards me. Meanwhile, I haven't seen the alien with the French beard since I last saw him at a shop. I knew at some level I should be a little cross at him for all the subterfuge that he orchestrated on me and Buster without our knowledge. But after seeing a madman like Corell and what he had planned for us, I could fully see and understand his point of view. With regards to the captain, I learned from the news that our pilots managed to take down both spaceships, killing all aliens on board. The media dubbed it as the greatest victory of mankind. I know you two have a share in that, buddy. Attaboy, I said, smiling while placing flowers by Buster's tombstone. I sat beside them for an hour before finally getting up to go back home. When I reached my apartment, I saw a small triangular box by the door. There was also a letter underneath it with my name on it. I opened the letter and began reading. Dear Michael, how are you doing? I hope you are better, at least much better than when I found you in the middle of the desert. I know the last few months haven't been easy. You must have many questions that bother you, and I would have ideally liked to see you in person to answer them. But I am not sure if I am somebody you would like to meet right now. So I am writing this letter to explain my side of things, in the hopes that it will give you some clarity and closure. My twin brother and I are part of a universal collective that was formed to combat players like Corell. so we settle down in various planets that are vulnerable to such attacks and help local civilizations as and when required. Our motive is to provide technological and strategic guidance that can be of help to these governments. Michael, I would be lying if I said I wasn't puzzled when you walked into my shop with your bizarre tale. It made absolutely no sense until you showed me the telescope. Even then, I had a hard time believing you. Most of all, I never expected you or Buster to end up in Corello's ship. It was a contingency that we thought would never come to pass. But somebody like Corello has always been a formidable opponent, and even civilizations that are more advanced have struggled to defeat him. So when I saw his telescope in your hand, I had to account for the possibility of the two of you coming face to face with each other. Whatever the circumstances, and however remote it may be, I had a duty to use all avenues that were available to me. So I decided to put a chip in your hand, while my brother stuffed a ball-like object into a muffin and fed it to Buster. The ball is actually our version of an EMP device that has the ability to severely cripple defense and aviation systems, but it can be activated only from within the confines of a spaceship and not from the outside. The device is designed to lay dormant and be virtually undetectable in such a state, and it can be activated only at a very specific frequency, right down to the decimal level. The chip that could emit such a frequency was inserted in your hand with a syringe gun, and when it activated, it also began to store everything you see and experience through your own eyes. So when we recovered the chip after admitting you in the hospital, we too got a glimpse of all that transpired inside the spaceship. Michael, I am going to be frank with you. I knew Buster wouldn't survive if the chip turned on, nor did I think you would live if you came in the crosshairs of someone like Corello. And yet, it is a call I would repeatedly make if the fate of a civilization hangs in the balance. But I never expected to see what came next following Buster's demise. That was something extremely rare even in my part of the world. It usually happens only when the departed has a very close bond with the living. However, I do apologize for not being honest with you, and for misleading you even when I knew your life would be in danger. Considering the bravery you and Buster showed in confronting Corello and his crew, I know you can understand better than most that sometimes fighting for a cause takes precedence over our own individual lives. If you ever feel the need to talk to me, I'm always here for you. I can be reached through William. This is not the end. Till then, so long my friend. Regards, Adam. I put the letter away and opened the box. There was a pair of sunglasses inside. I removed it from the box to take a closer look. It looked like regular sunglasses, but the frame had a series of small black buttons on either side. There was also a small note attached to the box. It read, "Michael, attention, please be careful if you are in the vicinity of a large power source or when there is a bolt of lightning coming your way, and always watch your six." I put on the glasses and pressed the first button I could reach. All my surroundings suddenly transformed into shades of amber. And I immediately turned around to see Buster, happily wagging his tail at me